I'm Sam Kimmins, Director of Energy at Climate Group, and as part of our Time to Triple campaign, focusing on the COP28 pledge to increase renewables around the world, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr Katye Altieri, Electricity Transition Analyst at the global energy think tank Ember. Thank you very much, Dr Altieri, for joining me today.
Thanks so much, Sam. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Katie, please could you give me an overview of your role with Ember and what the organisation does?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a global electricity transition analyst at Ember, and so I lead the research and writing of our work stream on the tracking global renewable energy commitments out to 2030. So the tripling global renewables pledge falls squarely under my remit. Last year, it was all about building confidence to try to get the tripling goal agreed to in COP28. This year, it's all about tracking government ambitions, whether that's regionally, so trying to encourage the G7 to show leadership, or from a technology perspective, so looking at wind targets specifically. How are we on track for wind in a global tripling? How are we on track for solar in a global tripling?
And I understand you just released a report on the analysis that you've done over the last 12 months since the COP28 tripling pledge on how the renewables market globally is doing. How are we meeting that pledge? Can you tell me a little bit more about it?
This particular report focuses on the updates that have been made to national targets since the global tripling pledge was agreed. So we assess the changes in targets, how are we on track for the global tripling, but then we also take a bit of a deep dive into solar targets and looking at the solar component of the tripling pledge, because as we all know, the solar market has just been, growing sort of out of control lately. And so we look at solar targets and look at solar market forecasts. And then this time around, we present the first assessment of national storage targets as compared to the storage market. So this COP, interestingly, the COP presidency letter expresses a desire to agree on a global goal to increase energy storage capacity at this COP. So last year was about tripling renewables. This year, it's more about enabling the support. What do we need around tripling renewables? And so our report will be released during COP on November 12th, just a few days before Energy Day. And it relies primarily on, we have an Ember 2030 Global Renewable Target Tracker, which you can find online. This is a great online resource where we're tracking national renewable energy targets for 96 countries and the European Union. So we don't account for all countries in the world, but we get to about 96% of the world's renewable energy capacity. So definitely getting the big hitters there.
And what are your key takeaways from the report?
Yeah, so there's three big things. The first is that last year, national targets were aiming for about a doubling of renewable capacity. And a year later, after 130 some odd countries signed the tripling pledge, we're still aiming for a doubling of renewable capacity. So the collective sum of national targets from COP28 to COP29 has increased by 4 gigawatts, which is a shockingly low number. So our first main finding is that country ambition just isn't there yet. Our second big finding is that national solar targets are just way out of touch with solar forecasts. I mean, solar deployment is exceeding predictions year on year on year. Last year was 87% up from the year before. This year, it's another almost 30% up. And so there's definitely not enough happening with solar targets compared to the solar market, which is raging. And then with battery additions, this is, like I said, our new focus this year looking at storage, is that battery additions are growing. The battery market is happening. Additions are up 136% this year over last year. I mean, it's humongous. But only about 30 countries even have storage targets. And they sum to just under 300 gigawatts, whereas the COP presidency and the IEA are all calling for about 1,500 gigawatts. So we're falling quite far short there. So those are our three main sections of analysis in the report.
And in that way, your findings do really support the IEA findings that delivery is falling way behind, or the ambition is falling way behind. Why are countries falling short?
It's interesting. I mean, there are some more optimistic forecasts out there. So BNEF is forecasting, an almost tripling, 10,000 something gigawatts. And they've been pretty optimistic. And with respect to solar, and I've actually been one of the few who have almost predicted nicely the rise in solar. And And then the IEA also has some of their more advanced, their accelerated forecasts, which get us pretty close to a tripling. It's 2.9-fold. But what's interesting to me about these projections about are we going to reach tripling, not reach tripling, is that even in the past year, our forecasts for where we're going to be in 2030 have increased dramatically. A year ago, the IEA would have said less than 8,000 gigawatts. BNEF would have said less than 8,000 gigawatts. Now, a year later, they're both saying, well, actually, 10,000, 10,500 is reasonable. So I think that, the market is moving so quickly that this, reach tripling, not reach tripling, it's starting to feel a little bit like we're actually pretty well on our way. Countries are falling short with ambition, but when you actually look at the market and deployments, we're definitely not as far off. Now we're not quite there, and there's more to be done. So I would say then you have to think about, not just ambition, but planning, finance. The other enablers then have to play a role.
So why do you think we're in this situation where the markets are racing ahead? Investors are investing in renewables at volume, but governments are reluctant to make targets and show ambition that even meets what the market is doing. Why do you think this is?
Well, I think there's a timescale issue, and then there's the reality of the economics issue. I think the solar has had rapidly declining costs. Policy environments that are really supportive to people just going out and buying solar panels and putting them on their roofs, or businesses taking the lead, without there necessarily being a national target, quote unquote. The technology is improving, manufacturing capabilities ramping up. The amount of solar produced in China in last year well outpaced global demand. Prices were down 50%. And so the technology is just being pushed. And it's similar for batteries. The battery storage costs, definitely. A decade ago, lithium-ion batteries were over $800 a kilowatt hour. Now you're, hovering around $100 a kilowatt hour, maybe a bit more. And they're better products than they were when they were $800 a kilowatt hour. And so there's just a natural economics there that happens. But then the second thing I would say is there is a natural cycle here. When you have something like a 5-year energy plan, you're not just going to all of a sudden, because there's a COP28 tripling agreement, cut into your 5-year planning cycle to release a new number, right? There's quite a few big elections that have happened over the past year or so around the world. And so I think sometimes government targets have more to do with those factors than necessarily that there's an actual lack of ambition. It's more political cycles.
So to an extent, you see that governments will catch up as the policy cycles come around. The next set of targets that they release for their countries will be more in line as they, they're aware. You're saying that, alluding to them being aware of these changes, but it's just not the right time for them to change their targets.
Yeah, I think that's possible. And I think the NDCs could play a really big role here, with 2025 being a year for NDCs.
Excellent. Do you see a risk if it is left too much up to the market, just in terms of the balance of getting the right renewables in the right place at the right time?
Absolutely. I think targets definitely play a role in terms of signaling to the market that there is this sort of willingness and ability to take on this renewable capacity. There's also this idea around clean flexibility and how important that is for supporting the rollout of solar and wind. And there is definitely, you want to minimize your loss of those renewable power as they come online, right? You want to make sure it's all being used efficiently, because it's not just about installing the capacity for the sake of it. It's about generating a certain amount of renewable electricity. And so for that, you need planning, you need supportive policies, you need clean flexibility. And so the targets can play a really important role there in making sure there's an efficiency in this rollout.
And within that, of course, balancing the grid, making sure that it's electricity is there when you need it. And your report talks a lot about battery infrastructure, but this isn't really talked about much in the global conversation when it really is an essential part of the energy transition. Why do you think that battery technology gains so little attention? Is it because it's not visible? Is there a nervousness around it?
I think this next year, you're actually going to see a real change in that. We've at Ember coined this the Clean Flex COP. And I think this will be a COP where this 1,500 gigawatt storage target for 2030 is agreed upon. And I think that's going to bring a lot of attention to batteries. In the IEA net zero scenario, 1,200 gigawatts of that 1,500 gigawatts in 2030 is battery storage. And batteries, they can play so many roles, storing excess renewables during times of abundance or times of low demand. You release it when you need it. You can stabilize your grid on millisecond levels all the way up to daily flexibility. Storage combined with solar, is just a game changer for stretching out that resource that we have right now. Costs are getting lower. It's modular, much like solar has been able to be really rapid because of this small scale. It's not like building a wind turbine in your backyard. Solar, battery, these are things that the average person can understand, can use. A given company can make it happen. So I think it will become part of the sort of mainstream discussions. It's already happening on the grid. If you look somewhere like California, battery capacity's increased 13-fold and something like that over the past 5 years. So solar there is stretching from daytime into the evening. So their gas power plants are becoming almost redundant. So it's happening. I think COP will help with making it part of the discussion. And it will definitely become, I think, a big part of our discourse over the next year.
Aside from the installation of the actual renewable technology itself and the storage technology itself, the turbines, the panels, the batteries, the geothermal plants, etc., what do you think is going to make the biggest difference in reaching the target to triple?
Yeah, I think recently IRENA and the Global Renewables Energy Alliance and the COP29 presidency released a really nice report that included a number of recommendations for enabling the transition. And these include things like, strengthening international cooperation, scaling up finance being a huge part of it, not just batteries, but also grids. So modernizing, expanding infrastructure, getting batteries and clean flexibility involved. I think all of these are the sort of enabling things that have to happen around the installation of capacity to make sure that, as I said, that capacity actually gets us to the clean generation we need and to the emissions reduction we need.
I do want to touch on another question, and that's around the just transition and how globally even this growth is, because of course, tripling renewables, some countries are starting from a very low base, some are starting from a very high base. Do you see a risk that some countries will be left behind?
There's certainly gaps in terms of, if you look at a regional allotment of, so for example, Climate Analytics has a regional assessment of where they think how the tripling goal should be allocated regionally. And there are some regions where there's a big gap in terms of the relative amount of renewables that are being deployed. So for example, in the Middle East and North Africa, there's a big, it's not necessarily that they have a massive gigawatt contribution to the tripling renewables, but, they're a fairly significant 75% short of where their targets need to be for 2030. That's a region that really needs to pick up steam. Sub-Saharan Africa is another one where, in terms of national targets by 2030, the numbers are quite low. And even in terms of their contribution to global tripling, it's not huge. But yet they're really falling short of even reaching that number that isn't huge. And that's, has a lot to do with international cooperation and finance and the just energy transition, because this is electricity for giving people energy access. This isn't about, necessarily displacing fossil fuel, but actual original energy access. And so, I think that's definitely where our challenges lie, not necessarily challenges to meeting the total global tripling, but challenges to making sure that there's energy access and an equitable distribution to the benefits of clean power.
So the risk here is not just that we don't meet the target globally, it's that those countries actually fall behind and their populations don't get the access to electricity that they need in order to develop.
Absolutely.
There's an interesting different angle, because we often can get caught up on the targets and forget the human dimension of this. A final question, are you optimistic?
I'm very optimistic. I think the more you look at what's happening on the ground in different countries, the more we see the diversity in countries where the clean power revolution is happening, the different ways and pathways that are available, the unique ways that different states and countries are really getting renewable electricity onto the grid, and the fact that a lot of places, that have seen great solar deployment or great wind deployment aren't even necessarily the sunniest or the windiest places. We haven't tapped our best resources globally, and that's a big reason that I feel confident that this can happen.
Dr. Altieri, thank you very much for speaking with us today, and we very much look forward to seeing the release of the report at COP.
Thanks so much, Sam. It's been great to talk about global tripling of renewables with you.